Hi, I'm Sean. Today I'll be talking about the IKEA Effect and how it can help you improve developer onboarding to your product. Over 3 years ago, I was the co-founder of Kitematic. The product we were building was a desktop application that made Docker extremely accessible to new developers. It solved one of the biggest problems at the time, which was there wasn't a streamlined way to install Docker and try out to get started with it for new users. After the launch of Kitematic, we got incredible traction and were eventually acquired by Docker. Since joining Docker, I've been responsible for multiple products and projects that are top of the user funnel. I helped solve many of the challenges with getting started on Docker and expanded addressable market. For developer experience and onboarding, my co-founders and I have always had a guiding light when we're building and designing. And that is, we realized there's an uncanny resemblance between taking a trip to IKEA and setting up the furniture and onboarding a developer. I'm going to explore the key aspects to building a seamless onboarding experience, similar to that of IKEA's. I would like to get started with the IKEA effect, which is consumers place a disproportionately high value on products they partially created. In the world of developer products, this means to improve the perceived value of the product, the developer has to go through a hands-on experience, possibly involving a tutorial that covers a meaningful real-world example. It's important to emphasize that why the user have to go through the example, because we're all busy people, and to make a product, we should respect the time of our users. And just a simple hello world is not enough to demonstrate the value of your product. It's recommended that the example is related to how developers will actually use your product in the real world. It's end-to-end and will inspire more thoughts on how to use the product later for more use cases. Just like the IKEA showroom, the consumers see different visions of what their place could potentially look like, get excited about it, and decide to buy the furniture and set them up later eventually. A good example is the Meteor's tutorial website. It showcased a bunch of familiar applications that developers can build. They also presented the list of great Meteor projects created by other companies to show that Meteor is future-proof and can be depended upon. Meteor is also easy to install with a simple curl script on Mac and Linux and an installer on Windows. However, one of the biggest challenges that every user's computer is in a different state, and it takes a lot of work to actually make sure the developers can successfully install your product, while covering a lot of the edge cases and errors that can come up. There are alternative ways to get around this, though. The first one is through a more simulated tutorial, like the Google's Go Playground or Ruby's 10-minute online challenge. So this way, it's a simulated environment, and it's not actually on the user's laptop. Another way is to package your product into Docker containers. Software will run exactly the same way on every computer with Docker installed. And Docker is currently experiencing great adoption, especially for local environments. So we've been doing great work on Docker for Mac and Windows to make sure that installing Docker is as easy as double-clicking an icon. The next point I'd like to talk about is that for onboarding, developers should feel the wow factor in less than 15 minutes. It makes sense because it would be ridiculous if an IKEA furniture takes days to set up. The challenge here, though, is to identify the wow factor for your product, which is different for everyone. It will require deep understanding of your user base and your product. I'm going to give some examples on what I perceive as the wow factor for the following examples. For Meteor, I was wowed by how much faster it is to create a real-time application that otherwise would take me a long time to build, using the languages that I'm familiar with as a web developer. This is a huge step forward in terms of ease of use compared to how I had to do it before. For Stripe, I was wowed by how much faster it is to integrate a payment form and start charging money for my business. I love seeing the transactions and customers in the dashboard right after it's set up. I also remembered back then, I helped a friend to build a booking system for his small business venue, and it only took like less of a day's work using Stripe and Meteor. And for my own product, Kitematic, our factor was that users can install Docker, run and see the result of a container on a blank laptop in less than 5 minutes. We were almost being religious about that metric. The last point I'd like to talk about is that most developers are naturally tinkerers and learn by exploration. It's important to actually do the extra hard work to allow developers to actually do that. Just like IKEA, they did the hard work to make the wood pieces fit perfectly together when you're setting them up. And sometimes a good design involves putting the extra thought and effort into these details that the users might not actually see. IKEA thinks these details through, and here are some of the examples that you can focus on as well for developer onboarding. The first extra bit of work you can do is to have a reliable setup and install. Streamline and automate the process as much as you can, and actually make the number of successful installs a metric. As an example, Kitematic actually abstracted away the entire Docker installation process with a simple double click. The process includes a lot of dependencies, such as installing VirtualBox, downloading, installing boot Docker VM, and asking users for password. All that is encapsulated and abstracted away in this UI, so to make it seamless for developers. And we wrote close to 1,000 lines of code just to do this simple installation. To step up the hard work, I actually recommend thoroughly going through the edge cases and gracefully handle errors. I like to bring up a weird example. Microsoft, they actually do a great job on showing the errors. It shows you how what the likely cause of the error is. It tells you the things you can try to fix it. All these information and resource actually help you to learn about the underlying technology. The other great example is Visual Studio's, is Microsoft's Visual Studio and how they handle exceptions. They have tips for troubleshooting, and also what's important is they actually tell you that you can get help online, which is showing that Microsoft and its community has got your back, so you don't have to worry when you're running into an error. There's also a design trick you can do with onboarding. It's called progressive disclosure, which is a design technique to ease users into more complex tasks by reducing clutter, confusion, and cognitive workload earlier in the experience. I'll explain this more using an example that is familiar to us all. Games. Some of them are inherently very complex, and yet players can still learn about games and pick it up relatively fast. It's because they use the technique really well. So in this case, I'll use StarCraft as the example. In the beginning, you have a base and a couple miners. One of the only things you can do is, get them moving and start mining. And once you get the hang of moving units around and accumulated enough resource, you can start building a barrack and start producing marines. After you get the hang of the game mechanics and learn how the basic combat works, the game slowly introduces you to a variety of units that are both similar in attribute to marines and can also be very different. And once you get all the units, you can start deriving more complex strategies you can use to help you win the games. This way you can ease users into the game without giving them mental overload and discourage them right away. As a bonus, doing all this hard work actually helps you reduce the work in writing documentation. If you remember IKEA's documentation, It's literally just pictures without much text. And on the developer world, the Stripe documentation has always been an inspiration. The developers don't have to read that much text, and they can get by pretty well just using the code snippets and the awesome gadgets that they have. All the hard work mentioned above will help developers get started much faster. Developers love high-quality products, and you get to widen and secure the top of your funnel for your product. To sum it all up, the IKEA effect is to have hands-on and useful example. Have your product give users the 0 to wow moment in less than 15 minutes. Let the developers tinker and explore by doing all the hard work for them. And I think the essence of this talk is to really keep an eye out for everyday things, as connecting all these concepts that appear unrelated could be the key to new inspirations. Thank you. I think for us is actually talking to a lot of users, actually sitting them down and watch them use the app, the product that you're building, and also doing user research, asking questions like, when do you feel like you actually feel like you got the product? I think that's a really good question to ask for developers. I think one thing you can do is it's still the beginning that takes a lot of time. For example, a user, it would be easier if they already have, for example, EC2 instance up and running, so they can, there are things you can do to maybe make the software aware of that instance. But if you have a case where you don't have the EC2 instance, you kind of have to do a lot of work there to, on your documentation, or either through some kind of a GUI on your end to help with that experience. I think getting the instances up and running is the biggest friction for a lot of these kind of products. And and that's why in the before PaaS was really popular, is because they actually handle the hosting part for you from the development environment to production. But now users actually want more power and customization, so that they have to bring in their own nodes. I remember back then for us, at least for Kitematic, it was new users, developers that don't have to be Silicon Valley. So I came from Canada, and we work with a lot of enterprises back then. And it's mainly targeted towards those developers who don't really have a lot of time in their day to figure out in depth how something works and then set it up themselves. What they were kind of looking for is like a double-click thing. And there were a lot of challenges, because installing VirtualBox takes time, downloading a VM and setting it up takes time. So it's really dependent on getting those people to try it out and see if they get stuck, or if the download is slow using their internet. So kind of really sitting down with them and figure and just observe. And also there are ways to measure as well. So for example, if you use Mixpanel, you can track when it started and when it ended, the timestamp, and calculate the difference. Yep, that's a good concern. And I think it's important to know who you're targeting beforehand. For example, Kitematic, we know that that there's there could be challenges with offboarding them to more complex workflows later, but it's more like I mentioned, this progressive disclosure. So it will eventually kind of introducing new features one at a time to help them. And also documentation is a good way to kind of offset that. As they get more into the software, they can start learning more from documentation. But also, one other example I can give is if I've used the GitHub for Mac app, and there's also like GitHub Tower, which are, the GitHub for Mac is similar to targeting newer users on Git, while Tower is more for professionals who use features like rebase and merging more than the other type of users. So kind of figuring out who you are targeting early in the and then know the consequences is really important. So I think most, early, when you're really early, the figuring out who you're really targeting is a challenge. So we had the problem in the beginning of so we actually have more complex features that are inconsistent with what we're trying to do for the simpler version of Kitematic. So for example, we had a way to build Docker files. Those type of user may not be the same kind of users who just want to get started and run a container. But introducing them to, for example, the Docker file building feature, it's actually kind of overwhelming for them. And it has to introduce new concepts and dependencies such as Docker images that they have to understand. So it actually made it more complex to actually accomplish the task that I intended them to do. And then so for the next version, we decided to purposely remove that feature from the product. Thank you.